I have a friend, and we were talking about talking about religion and so on and so forth, and she was saying that she had come across an advertisement once from the Unitarian Church in the town where she was, and basically the church said the Unitarian Church had an ad in the paper that said, is God keeping you away from church? Essentially saying, if you have a problem, right, with the idea of a personal God, right, an anthropomorphic God or whatever it is, right, is that keeping you away from church, right? Because you shouldn't let your theology sort of get in the way of all the other things, right, that going to church can bring you. And I said, that's very funny, because when I was a kid, it was the opposite. Church was keeping me away from God, because I grew up Christian, and I was as I got through my teens and 20s, I became increasingly uncomfortable in church. I knew that I had some sort of relationship with God, but I didn't have a relationship with the Christian God. And so eventually I sort of realized, I should be going to the synagogue instead of going to the church. And that, for me, that was the way for me to connect with God. But there's a whole other, right, category of folks, right, for whom it really isn't that they have a relationship with God, but they just need to sort of find the right venue, right, in which it can flower, right? Much more that they really don't have a sense of God that works for them, right? And so what do you do about that, right? And I have found, especially since COVID, right, that people really are craving a lot of what religion can bring, right, which is a sense of community, which is a sense of singing together, right, of having a kind of a fellowship with other people's conversations about spiritual topics, right, and but the problem for many people remains, right, that how do I make sense of God, right? And for other people, of course, that's not really an issue, but it's interesting to think about. So anyway, so I thought we would look at this essay. So the title is really only touches on about half of the essay. So we've got to get through the first half of the essay to get to the second half of the essay, and that's where he kind of discusses about the praying to the God you don't believe in. So we'll start with the first half, and we'll see the first half is much more about the problem with evil, right?
With evil?
Evil, the problem of evil. Right? I'm sorry?
Good week for that.
Yes, exactly. And how do we make sense of how much evil is in the world, right? And this is a perennial problem, right, for religious people and for non-religious people. Yes, Connie.
Is that air conditioning necessary?
Jacob, do you think you can see if we can turn off that fan?
Yeah, it makes so much noise.
It is very noisy. It's interesting. I was aware of the noise, but hadn't really placed it. So thank you, Connie, for.
No, but there's a fan. That's what's making.
Yeah, the fan is going.
Put it on auto.
Great guns. And I can use the microphone if that would help people. All right, so we'll try this. All right, so the world. So this is written by Scott Hershowitz, and he's a professor of philosophy, and he's written a new book about children and philosophy. And there was a review of the book in the Times, as well as this little excerpt of it. The review was interesting. It basically said, the book, it's good, it's not good, whatever it is, but this guy Hershevitz keeps on talking about his kids, right? And the kids are preteens. What are they going to think about it when they're a little older? Are they going to be a little upset with their dad for bringing them so much into the public eye? So anyway, but it's a thing that a lot of us do now, right? We still tell stories about our kids, and now that there's the internet, right, millions of people can see these stories as opposed to just our friends. All right, so the world is awful at the moment, he says. Millions have died of COVID-19. Authoritarianism is on the rise abroad and at home. And now there's war, right? The war in Ukraine, with all the death, destruction, and dislocation that entails. In dark times, many people seek refuge in religion. They hold fast to their faith. But darkness also drives many people away from God, right? Before we get to the specific of Rex, I thought we could just discuss that idea. Go ahead, Judith.
Could you give a sentence or two on the word authoritarianism in this context?
Yeah. So authoritarianism, I think, Putin and Russia, right? The guy whose name is escaping me at the moment. Not Zelensky, no, not Zelensky. The other guy, the guy in Hungary, Orban in Hungary, the Justice and Law Party in Poland. We see it with certain figures on the right wing in this country, right? People who might be described as Christian nationalists, who sort of have a vision of society, right, where everyone sort of has basically the same religion, right, or at least acknowledges that there is a religion that's better than all the others. Problematic for the Jews, right, because that religion is almost never Judaism, and even if it were, that's not really a Jewish way of looking at the world, right, as our religion is better than all the others. We know that can't possibly be the case because it's such a small religion. So it's definitely the best religion for us, but everyone else should have the religion they want. And politically, right, it has led to a situation where fewer people are able to vote, right, where there's sort of increasingly built-in injustice into, and the current concern, right, about abortion rights is one of those things, right, that we are losing a right to bodily autonomy at a national level. And so that's kind of what I think he's talking about in terms of authoritarianism. All right, but I wanted to sort of focus more on the dark times and either the appeal to religion, right, or its opposite, which I think is a very interesting sort of take, right, that because there's so much evil in the world, right, that makes us turn away from God, right? Yeah, go ahead, Connie.
It's also, some people feel that God turned his face
Right.
away.
Right.
So if some people during the Holocaust, like Elie Wiesel, could find religion, but other I'm sure, wondered where was God.
Right. And it's, and it's very, there's no easy answer, right, to this question, right? And that feeling of abandonment, right, by God, right, it's a very terrible feeling, right? But it's interesting, right, that there is such diverse responses, right? That there are people who found a new depth of their religious life in the context of the oppression of the Holocaust, right? And there are other people, of course, who completely lost any capacity for faith, right? And I don't have any explanation for how there could possibly be such a wide, in such disparate responses, right? But it is interesting to me that when we're not talking about such extreme things, right? We're just talking about, say, a 13-year-old kid, as this guy is about to do, studying for his bar mitzvah, right? That the presence of bad stuff in the world, right, makes him cynical about God, right? So yeah. So I not that the stuff you're bringing up is not important, Connie, but I think the people that we're kind of talking about today are not Holocaust survivors, right?
And that's the difference.
Well, I don't know if it's the difference, but I think I think it is different, right? I think someone who has endured, really significant trauma and oppression, right, is going to be in a different situation than a kid, or not a kid, right, whose life has the regular traumas of just being alive, right, but not the extremity, right, of something like the Holocaust. And because those people are just as likely, right, to say, "Oh, the world is so terrible. How could God let it be this way?" Go ahead, Nick.
The young person is that how can they be lift because the young person's point of view, their trauma is just as serious.
Oh yes.
So it's of a different manner, but they feel it just as strong.
Right.
We feel.
Right. No, and I'm not saying that their trauma is not real. All I'm saying is that there's the incredibly imprecise and impossible task of sort of setting aside various types of trauma, right, as being somehow something other than others. I mean, there's no way to compare people's experience of trauma, because the same person, the two different people will go through very similar experiences and come out with completely different reactions to them. And so what's traumatic for one person is not going to be traumatic for the other. So it's such a complicated topic. All I'm saying is not that they don't feel it as real, just that it's of a different order. So my older son Rex, right, is one of them. He's studying for his bar mitzvah, but he doesn't believe in God, right? We know a lot of Jews like this, right? This is not an uncommon situation, right?
He doesn't have to. He has to learn the bar mitzvah.
Right, of course, right, and that's one of the reasons. That's one of the ways in which, right, Judaism is a little bit distinct from a lot of other religions.
Yeah, you're a Jew. You can't get out of
You
it.
can't get out of being a Jew, but you don't have to believe in God if you don't wanna.
But
Right?
you don't have to sign anything.
Right. There's no catechism that you got to believe in. Right now, of course, Maimonides would disagree with that. Right? Maimonides would say there are the the sort of tenets of our faith, and if you don't believe in them, right, then sorry, you're not really Jewish. Right? Yeah. Go ahead, Mary.
For Christians, kids usually don't even think about first communion. But when it comes to confirmation, they're a little old,
Yes.
and there are kids who go through the whole process of getting ready and say, I'm not doing it. Or either I need more time,
Right.
or I'm not doing it currently. And it's not unusual to have one or two kids in the class. It's not doing that.
Yeah. Right.
It used to be kids would never think of that. Now they-
Right.
So-
Well, I think that's a very interesting distinction, right, between Christianity and Judaism, right? Is that you can still go ahead with your bar mitzvah,
Yeah.
right, even if you consider yourself an atheist, because it's even in the Talmud it says, you go ahead, fine, don't believe in me as long as you follow my rules, right?
It says that.
Yeah.
Now you tell me.
it's an opinion in the Talmud.
Really?
Yeah, it's not the opinion in the Talmud, because
Nobody told me.
yeah, but it's but in Christianity, right, if you don't believe, right, if there's certain things if you don't believe, right, there's really a question as to whether or not you can confirm your Christianity, right? That's one of the reasons it's called confirmation. And it's actually interesting, Mary, that in the Reform movement, at least, I don't know about the other movements, but in the Reform movement, there is a process called confirmation, which happens after the bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, and kids, 16, 17, go through a similar kind of a learning process. I don't know if it involves, affirming, the religious, sort of the theology of the Reform movement, or if it's more. I can't believe it's that, because people wouldn't sign up. But anyway, so this is Rex, right? Rex is studying for his bar mitzvah, but he doesn't believe in God. He told me that one day when we were taking a walk. Why not? I asked him. If God was real, he wouldn't let all those people die. He was talking about the pandemic, but he could have been talking about the killing of civilians in the Kiev suburb of Bucha, or any number of other atrocities he's been exposed to in his short life, right? And this is what Harriet, I think, is talking about, right? Is, that kids are aware, right, of the trauma in the world, right? They may not have experienced it directly themselves, although plenty of kids have lost parents and grandparents, right, to COVID-19, right? But, they read the news, they see the images on television, right? They see these traumatic events, and it shakes them, right? It shakes them in the way that it shakes us as adults, right? And of course, it's really interesting, this idea that, if God were real, right, God wouldn't let all these people die, right? Whereas it's very interesting, right, that I think most religions grapple with trying to figure out, that there is this reality, right, of a life cycle, right, that in order for people to live, other creatures, at the very least, and even to a certain extent, other people have to die, right? That you can't have life unless you have death, right? But I don't think that's exactly what Rex is talking about, right? Rex is talking about tragic death, right? He's talking about untimely death. He's talking about violent death.
Untimely.
Right. And why do you say that? God is supposed to care about us, Rex said. That doesn't seem like something you'd let happen if you cared and could stop it, right? So this is the classic problem, right? Why the bad things happen to good people formulation. Is everyone familiar with that book?
Rabbi.
Yeah, it's Rabbi Kushner, Harold Kushner, right? And his answer is that God does care, right? God cares excessively, but God actually doesn't have the power to stop death, right? Yeah.
God has given people choices, the ability to make decisions.
Right.
Bad people make those kind of choices.
Right.
Human.
Right. Right. You can say that certainly about the Russians in Bucha, right? That God gives free will, right? And that means that people are free to commit crime, right? And God, by giving free will, can't prevent the crime, right? We begin to sort of get a sense, right, from the Rabbi Kushner perspective, right, that God, presumably, in creating the world, God has unlimited power, but God limits God's own power right, in order to allow humans some level of autonomy, right? Some level of a capacity to make up our own minds, right?
Which costs a lot of money
Well,
to connect, to go away.
what,
If you make a choice not to stick around, that costs a lot of money, it ruins you.
yes, it's not a good idea. All right, so Rex says if God could stop it and God cared, God would, right? So I'm already anticipating Rabbi Kushner's response to Rex, right? So this is the problem of evil. Oops, sorry. This is the problem of evil, an old philosophical question. Rex had never heard of it, but it's not uncommon for kids to rediscover ancient arguments on their own, right? That's one of the reasons we have ancient texts, right? Is they tend to sort of bring out a lot of ancient problems, right? Ancient texts that have stuck around for a long time. It kind of suggests, right, that these are not new problems. They're the same old problems that we've been struggling with for millennia, and every generation has to struggle with them on their own and rediscover them very often, right? They're thinking the world through, and if you think about God, right, and this is one of the issues about the God that you do or do not believe in, right, is very often people have a very simplistic idea of God, right? That God should be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, right? Or as he puts it here, endlessly empathetic. Right?
And soothing.
And soothing, right? That God should be, right, that, all you have to do is pray and everything will be okay, right? Unfortunately, right, we know that's not true, right? Or as a friend of mine said about a bad day she was having, and she managed to make the day a little better by having some ice cream. She said, I had the ice cream. I still had all the problems I had before I had the ice cream, but I just felt more able to deal with them.
She didn't know how to eat it.
Oh, is that what it is? Because if she had eaten it the right way, all the problems would have gone away? All right, well, I'll tell her she was doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah. The existence of evil poses a serious puzzle. Why does God let us suffer? Why does God make a universe in which suffering is possible? So, yeah, it's a dilemma, right? And so for some people, right, the easiest response to such a dilemma is to deny the existence of God, right? Okay, I mean, that's what you want to do. But there's a lot, from my perspective, right, there's a lot of throwing away the baby along with bathwater. If you just sort of say there's no God and I'm not going to deal with religion at all. Of course, religion has its own problems, so I'm not trying to say it's a fantasy. People have proposed many answers, but most are poorly reasoned. For instance, some say that good requires evil, that it can't exist without it. It's not clear why that would be true, but the bigger problem is once you take that view, you call into question God's omnipotence. Well, actually, that's exactly what Rabbi Kushner does. Right? Rabbi Kushner says God is not omnipotent, right? Or God has chosen not to be omnipotent. Right? God has chosen to sort of withdraw God's self, right, in order to give more power to people, right? Which is a problematic endeavor, right? There is the story in the Talmud, right, that when God created the first human, right, the angels had a fight, right? Some of the angels wanted to get rid of this person, right? God, what are you doing? You're going to bring all these terrible things into the world, right? And then the other angels were saying, but they're also going to bring love and joy, right, and beauty and all the wonderful things that humans bring, right? And God looks at these two sides, right, and says, God has to make a decision. Am I going to create humans anyway, despite the fact that they're going to bring source into the world, right? Or do I just have this beautiful universe, right, without these human beings, and it'll be a much better place, right? no environmental degradation, as it turns out, right? Right? And God, so there's sort of on one side, there is chesed, right? Sort of loving kindness, and the other side there's din, right? There's sort of judgment, and God has to acknowledge that probably din is right? Probably the judgment side is right. That on when you total it all up, right? The tsuris probably will outweigh all the other stuff, but God takes din and tosses it to the ground and says, we're doing it anyway, right? And so we end up, right, with humans, with all the wonderful things that humans are, right? But also, of course, right, most of the problems in this world are human problems. Even COVID-19, right, probably stemmed from human error, right, from human activity.
That was a big statement.
What?
I think that was a very big statement.
What? That COVID-19 was a human thing? I don't think it was intentional, but I just think the way in which we exploit our natural environment, right, leads to these situations where animal viruses make a jump into humans, and that doesn't necessarily need to happen, right, if we were more careful, but we don't tend to be careful. But I may be wrong. I'm way above my pay grade here, so don't take anything I say for real.
Shows I'm listening.
Yeah, exactly. So it turns out there's something God can't do: create good without evil. Right. I mean, you could put it that way, but or again, you could put it. But again, as with much of this type of an article, right, the Talmud has already considered this problem, right, and said that God was well aware, right, that the evil would come if you make humans, the evil is going to come along with the good, and that was a deal that God was willing to make. But also, if good requires evil, maybe just a little bit would do, right? Is absolutely every evil in the world essential, right? Why can't we have a world that's just like this one, except without that twinge of pain I felt last Thursday? What kind of God can't soothe my sciatica, right? My physical therapist, Tony, makes my back feel better, and he doesn't even claim to be a deity. Right now, of course, you can claim, right, that why does Tony know what Tony knows, right? Because he's studied God's work, right? He's studied the way that humans are put together, right? And has learned, right? Because God has also put in us, right, the capacity to learn about the world, right? And to use science to make our lives better, right? That's part of God's plan, right? At least from a Jewish perspective. There are other religious perspectives that are more anti-science, or anti-scientific, goes against their dogma, right? All right. He is a hero, though, at least to me. And some say that's why God allows evil in the world, right? He doesn't care about pleasure and pain. He cares about what pleasure and pain make possible: compassion, redemption, and heroic acts, like Tony mending my back. To get these goods, though, God has to give us free will, and once we have it, some of us abuse it. Right? So that's, again, that's another, we've already made that argument. Right? This is historically the most influential answer to Rex's question, but I don't buy it. All right, so great. Why can't God create only those people who would use their free will well? Why can't he wave Paul Farmer through and keep Vladimir Putin out? It wouldn't be very free will if you weren't able to use your free will for evil, unfortunately, for Hershowitz here. Right? He knows in advance how each of them will act if he's really omniscient. All right, so now he's bringing up the topic of omniscience, right? And again, and I think that this is one of those situations where I get a little tired of these arguments, right? Because they are a little bit, you just kind of go in circles, right? There's no real way of getting to a philosophically satisfying answer about the nature of God. Which is why I think Maimonides likes to say that, right, you can't say anything definite about God, right? You can't say God is this or that. You can only say what God is not, right? You can't say that God is omniscient. You can just say that God is not omniscient, right? You can't prove that God is not omniscient. Again, is that really that helpful? I don't know if it's that satisfying.
But is it helpful just to avoid the word God?
Well, I think that's the second part of this essay, and I think that is actually one of the. So let's continue with it, because I think that's a great question. Is it better just to avoid the word God, right? Or is it, or as Maimonides I think would sort of suggest, and is that let's not put too much weight, right, on a definition of God, right, and instead sort of look at how we perceive, how we experience God in the universe, right? Approach God through metaphor and story, right, rather than through some sort of philosophical definition. So one of my favorite things, right, is that we're sitting here and having this conversation, right, animated, right, by the presence of God, right? It's not a Christian God or a Jewish God or a Muslim God. It's something that's
the idea of God.
It's not even an idea. It's an experience, right? It's an experience of the connection among the people in this room, right? Something that's more than just each individual person. And I don't know if that's convincing or helpful for anyone else, but that's one of the ways I think about it. I used to play in rock bands when I was younger, and one of the things I liked the most about the rock bands, playing in a rock band, it was not, believe it or not, the fact that there were all these young women who were very interested in me because I was playing in a rock band. I was very intimidated by those people, so I never that was not my thing. But what I loved, right, was that there was this group of boys. I only really played with boys for the most part in college, but there was this group of boys, and later when we added women to the group, it was no different, right? Is that there's this sort of, you get into what I call the groove. You're in the groove with these guys, and something is linking you together. Some sort of spirit, some sort of connection, right? That is there when you're playing together. That's not there in the same way when you're not playing music together. And so there was this deeply spiritual aspect of playing music together that is really magical, and it's not so dissimilar from the experience of praying in a group or singing in a group, whatever it is that we do today. Yeah, go ahead, Harriet.
I think your experience of music and those experiences.
Yes.
And it's such a intensity of feeling.
Yes.
It's so much.
Right.
They see it as we messed up the world. We didn't do the right things, so we were open to right, and so we didn't go through
Yeah.
and there's socialization is different.
Yeah. I mean, each generation, right? Each generation, you probably, most of this in this room probably remember when we were young and we sort of realized, how full of it our parents were, right? In our parents' generation, and how there were certain things that they just got wrong, and from our perspective, right? And now that we're older, right, we kind of have to put up with the fact that that we are now in the category of the people who sort of get it a little bit wrong, right? And if kids have a little bit of grace, they also recognize, oh well, they these older people also did get something right, right? because right, we're human, and this is sort of again, part of, to whatever degree this is true about people, right? It might also be true that God, as we conceive of God, sort of knows this about humans, right? Is that we learn, right? We very often learn through mistakes, right? We learn through doing things that unfortunately end up hurting ourselves or hurting other people, right? And so that is it's a vehicle for learning. Not that God sort of designed the universe that way, right? But that's just a fundamental truth about humans, right? That we often learn more from our failures than we do from our successes.
Hopefully.
But not always, right? We can always just sort of dig ourselves deeper into the hole, right? Which that's what Putin seems to be doing. Right? So some believers feel the force of these arguments, but maintain their faith nonetheless, right? So he's going to mention this Episcopal priest, right? I've already mentioned Harold Kushner, right? Who was dealt a very, very heavy hand, right? He had a son with a terrible disease who died very young, right? And he was immediately sort of confronted, right, with the need to sort of how to make sense of this world where there can be such terrible suffering, right? And Harold Kushner found a way for him that worked, a theology that works for him. Right? Marilyn McCord Adams, a philosopher and Episcopal priest, doubted that we could explain the existence of evil, but that didn't bother her. Right? A 2-year-old child, she explained, might not understand why his mother would permit him to have painful surgery. Nevertheless, he could be convinced of his mother's love by her intimate care and presence through the painful experience. Right? So, and it's not so distant, right, from Harold Kushner's idea, right, that that one thing about God not being omnipotent, right, not being able to magically take the pain away, right, is that allows us to sort of experience God's presence without necessarily expecting some sort of a miracle, right? And that so God's presence is what makes the difficulties of life endurable, right? For people who can believe in God. People who don't believe in God, they have to fight it other way.
I mean, through the actions of other people.
I think very often that is
Courageous or.
right. I think very often that is the way that especially Jews experience the presence of God, right? Through, people talk in Judaism, people talk about, our hands are the tools of God, right? That what humans do is, we are trying to behave in ways where we can manifest God's presence.
Like the righteous Gentiles.
Righteous Gentiles in the Holocaust, or doctors and physical therapists, right? Or just a friend who comes when you're in need, right? You have someone, but there is also just prayer, right? Even solo prayer, right? Very often people take real solace in prayer and the feeling of the presence of God, right? In the context of their prayer, that they talk to God, and just talking to God allows for an experience of the presence of God. And that's comforting, right? In the way that sometimes just talking about your problems makes them more bearable, right? If you do that to another person, right, you speak with another person, and then the problems you have aren't objectively any easier. I mean, despite what you said about the ice cream, right? But they are more bearable because they seem less insurmountable, right? And in Buddhism, right, very often it's just a matter of breathing, right? And mindfulness, right? And a lot of secular mindfulness is about just breathe, right? Just do some deep breathing, even for 30 seconds, right? Just breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold, breathe in, and do that 10 times, right? And then there's just a level of peace that will descend upon you. For those who feel the presence of God or have faith that they will feel it later, I think Ms. Adams' attitude makes some sense, but if I'm honest, it sounds too optimistic to me, right? He's a skeptic, right? He's an Epicurus. He doesn't believe in God, and he thinks that God's presence is not a real thing. Right? Okay. I'm with Rex. I think the problem of evil poses a serious barrier to religious belief, right? Right, and this is nothing new, right? Again, this is nothing new, right? We see this in the Talmud. We see this, again, like every generation thinks they've discovered atheism, right? It's just there's always people that don't believe in God. So, but still, Rex continues to study for his bar mitzvah. Why is that? Right? Now, one answer could be, well, because he's Jewish, right? So not believing in God is no impediment to Jewish identity or to the importance of learning the Jewish tradition, right, and Jewish practices, right, and so he's going to do it anyway. But I think he's getting at something different, right? He's getting at sort of this idea of praying to a God you don't believe in. So before Rex came along, I struggled to account for my own religious practice. I don't believe in God. So why do I fast on Yom Kippur and observe Passover? It's just what we Jews do, I might have said. Right? It keeps me connected to a community I value. Right?
And that's the phrase.
What?
It keeps me connected.
Yes. Right. So and I think that for a lot of people, right, is the reason why they retain, and not just in Judaism, right? I think for a lot of people who are either they would consider themselves atheists or they're deeply skeptical, right? The ancillary value of being part of a religious community, right? Of having a group of people that will be there when you're ill or when someone has died or you're having a celebration of a life cycle and you want to celebrate with people, these are the people you celebrate, right? And I think one of the real, unfortunate effects of the way our society thinks about religion, right, is that it sort of totalizes the idea of belief in God, right, in a way that makes people feel like they can't connect to communities, which is very sad, right? Because there's much more to religion than God, right? As the ad that I mentioned at the beginning, right? Is God keeping you away from church? Right? There's so many reasons to be part of church, right? If God keeping you away, that's too bad, right? So I'd still say that, I suppose, but when Rex was 4, he reframed my view of religion, right? And it's funny because I've had several with my younger son. I've had several conversations like this where his observations have kid observations have really sort of given me new insight into religious issues. So this guy just wrote them all down. So so one night when I was cooking dinner, he asked, "Is God real?" "What do you think?" I asked. I think God is real. I think that for real God is pretend, and for pretend God is real.
The son said.
No, that's what Rex said. No, my son said something different. Not quite as complicated as this. I was stunned. That's a big thought for a 4-year-old. It's a big thought for a 40-year-old. I asked Rex to explain what he meant. God isn't real, he said, but when we pretend, he is. Okay? Philosophers have a name for this sort of view. They call it fictionalism. I never heard of fictionalism until this article. Suppose I say Dumbledore teaches at Hogwarts. Who knows what we're talking about? Okay. Dumbledore is the headmaster in the Harry Potter series at a school called Hogwarts, right? So Dumbledore is the sort of the chief wizard in the fictional world of Harry Potter. If that was a claim about this world, right, it would be false, right? Because there is no Hogwarts, and there aren't any wizards, right? At least as conceived of in the Harry Potter universe, right? It's clearly fiction, right? Hogwarts doesn't exist here, and neither does Dumbledore, so we can hardly teach there. But they do exist in a different world, right? In this fictional world of Harry Potter. So the sentence Dumbledore teaches at Hogwarts, right, is true in that fiction, right? So in that world, right, an equally meaningless phrase in our world, which is like what's the word I'm looking for? What's the bad guy? Voldemort. Voldemort teaches at Hogwarts, right, is equally nonsensical in our world, right? But it's even more nonsensical, right, in the world of Harry Potter, right? Because Voldemort is Dumbledore's mortal enemy, right? So some philosophers are fictionalists about morality. They think rights aren't real except in stories that we tell. Others are fictionalists about numbers. They think that math is made up. I think both views are mistaken, right? I believe in morality and math. But I think Rex was right and on to something important. For real, God is pretend, and for pretend, God is real. So I'm a fictionalist about God. So I mean, I'm not sure if I actually buy this, right? But I think it is really it's an interesting sort of thought, right? That there is a yeah, go ahead, Judith.
The whole thing is saying that it is impossible in human language to say anything about God. That's what the whole ritual is getting at.
In a certain sense, right? It's a little bit of a Maimonidean take on it, right? That everything we say about God, right, exists in a kind of a fictionalized universe that makes God accessible, makes the idea of God accessible to humans.
Yeah.
Right?
In other words, we're trying.
We're trying to figure out how to make sense of it, and the only way to make sense of God, right, is to tell stories about God. Yeah, go ahead.
Or to look for what you might consider proof, like all miracles in nature, for example. Like
Right, but
hummingbirds.
right, but again, you have to sort of agree, right, to a fundamentally unverifiable view of the world, right, that God is behind all of it, right? And as a sort of an unverifiable view of the world, it's fiction, right? Now it's also true that it's unverifiable that there is no God, right? So that's an equally fictional view of the world, right? And of course, one of the problems with the current state of atheism today, right, is that people have this sort of idea that science is atheist, right, and anti-science is religion, right, which is completely those two things are not. There are people who don't believe in science on both sides, right, of the atheist theist divide. All right. So our family recently switched synagogues. At the old one, the service was mostly in Hebrew, and I don't speak much Hebrew. I know how to say all the prayers, I just don't know what most of them mean. So at synagogue, I would sing along and let the words wash over me. I liked that. Right? I tend to be that way as well. Right? I know what the words mean, but I still prefer to say them and sing them in Hebrew than to do it in English.
It's a ritual.
Well, it's a ritual, and also there's a richness in the original language, right, that is going to be lost if you choose one translation into English, right? There's a psalm that we say on a Friday night service, right, that says, I forget exactly what the Hebrew is, but the word in question is iyim, right, the word for island, right? It could be islands or it could just be lands, right? And in the version that I sort of got used to it is let all the distant islands rejoice. And as someone who goes to Nantucket on a fairly regular basis, I used to like that because it made me think of Nantucket, right? In the most recent prayer book that we've got, they don't translate it as islands, they translate it as distant lands, right? Which is just different, right? And I like the other translation better. So at least I know the Hebrew well enough to know that I change it in my head, right? But there is that sort of limitation of translation that's not there for Hebrew, even if you do understand it. At the New Synagogue, we sing a lot of the same songs and say a lot of the same prayers, but we say many more of them in English. And I find that almost intolerable. It turns out I like my religion inscrutable, right? And that makes some amount of sense to me. I do think that part of there are people obviously who want the Latin Mass because of some sort of conservative impulse, but I think there are also some people who prefer a Latin Mass in Catholicism because they don't know exactly what it's saying, right? It has all. Go ahead, Mary.
It has that mystery piece.
Exactly. There's all this mystery, right? And
until they put out some of the new prayer books in the 50s, you had no idea.
right. And people who had studied their Latin really, really well maybe had a better idea than. But even those of us who study Hebrew and can read the Hebrew and understand what it's saying, right? We still get a level of mystery, right? A level of sort of fictionalization, so to speak, because, right, it's not necessarily in our it's another reason why very often I like the King James style of translation, right? Because it takes, even in English, right, it takes the language out of the language of the everyday and puts it into some other kind of more mysterious register. All right. I just don't believe the stories we tell, right? And hearing them in English forces me to confront that over and over again, right? So that's for him, right? And I think, I actually think it a more productive, I think this is the end. Okay. Let's read to the end and then I want to say, what I think would be more productive, but we only have a minute left. Still I pretend, and I don't plan to stop because pretending makes the world a better place. Right? So he has this sort of functionalist understanding, right, that by being part of a religious community, by telling our stories again and again, whether we, understand them in the moment or we don't, right, that this has an effect on the world which is positive, right? I learned that from my kids too, Rex and his younger brother Hank. Pretending blurs the boundaries between this world and the ones we imagine. It breathes life into stories, letting them shape the world we live in. Just think of the delight kids take in Santa Claus, even those who know deep down that he's not real, right? And the Soviet equivalent of this was Dядя Lenin, right? So Vladimir Lenin was obviously dead, but kids, each generation of kids in the Soviet Union would sort of at some point realize that Lenin had died, decades before, and it was always this big tragedy for them, right? The same sort of way that people are really upset when they realize, right, that Santa Claus isn't real, right? Or the way they lose themselves in play, right? Or in a novel, right, about a world where wizarding is actually a real thing, right? Pretending makes the world more magical and more meaningful, and it's not just for kids, right? That this sort of sophisticated pretending, right, is actually a way of working out, and this is one of the reasons why I think actually that he shouldn't necessarily be so upset that we retell the story, right? One of the things we do in the prayer service, right, is that we remember the Exodus from Egypt. You're supposed to do that twice a day in Judaism, right? So you're obviously we do it in Passover, but you're also supposed to do it every single day. You're supposed to, at least twice a day, read the blessing after the Shema that talks about God taking the Israelites out of Egypt. Which, did it happen in real life? Did it not happen in real life? Right? Ultimately, we can disagree about that. And I would say also, ultimately, it doesn't really matter, right? Because what really matters, right, is that we're telling ourselves a story about liberation, right? And about the power of God to effect deliverance, right? And thus that we should not lose hope. even in the face of terrible oppression. Right? When it feels like the world is falling apart, I seek refuge in religious rituals, but not because I believe my prayers will be answered. The prayers that we say in the synagogue remind me that evil has always been with us, but that people persevere, survive, and even thrive. I take my kids so that they feel connected to that tradition, so that they know that the world has been falling apart from the start, right? It's not a big mystery, right? When does the world start falling apart? As soon as right, as soon as Adam and Eve start eating the stuff they're not supposed to eat. And I guess what I would say, right? As soon as they begin to grow up, right? As soon as you begin to be able to perceive the world as it really is, you realize that it's falling apart. Right? And so kids can see that as clearly as adults can see, right? Once you get to a certain age, 4 or 5, whatever it is, when you begin to sort of, be able to understand that the world is not a permanent place. Developmentally, it just happens, right? And that there's beauty in trying to put it back together, right? The sort of newest mitzvah in Judaism, right? The Tikkun Olam, right? There's no blessing in traditional Judaism for Tikkun Olam, but the Reform movement made one, right? Because, right, it's such an important part of our tradition, right? That there's real beauty, right, in trying to repair the world, right? That's in a sense that's what we're here to do, right? Soon Rex will stand before our congregation and pray to a God he can't quite believe in. It'll be a magical morning, and for that moment at least, we'll transcend the troubles of the world. All right. So, final thoughts. I know we're over time, so I apologize for that.
Religion helped the doctor in World War II.
Yeah, some people.
Ritual.
Yes, ritual. Right. I think rituals always help. Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but it can be challenging to find. I think one of the things that we've realized in the sort of more atomistic way that we live today, right, is that we have a perception that ritual is very helpful, but which ritual becomes a major question.
But if
Right.
you're Jewish, it would be Orthodox.
There's plenty of rituals in non-Orthodox Judaism.
Well, we didn't know about it.
You didn't know about it, right? Exactly. You didn't know about it, and there's plenty of ritual in Catholicism and in other forms of Christianity, right? And there's always this sort of question, I think, in our day, where we're so focused on individual fulfillment, right? There's always this sort of struggle between, am I going to be part of this collective? Am I going to sort of submerge myself into whatever collective we're talking about? And to what degree am I going to be autonomous from that collective, right? And we often see very clearly the danger of submerging ourselves. We don't necessarily see quite as clearly the dangers that come with separating ourselves, right? And because isolation is now sort of the way we live today. But hopefully we can overcome it. All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. So we will, so I'm sorry about Monday. I was called away for a funeral at the last minute on Sunday. But next Monday, God willing, we will meet and learn together. And next Wednesday too, I believe. The reason we're not meeting next Wednesday?
I thought you were not here.
Next Wednesday, I'm not here. That's exactly right. So next Wednesday, we will not meet because it's the 25th of May.
I thought we were meeting, but you were not here.
No, I think we canceled. I think we decided to postpone. We decided to postpone. So you guys could meet. Do you want to do a session?
Oh, yeah, we can do that. That's true.
Why don't you do a session about
Okay.
you?
Okay.
Okay. So Jacob will lead our soul search next week. I just won't be here. And so be nice to him, okay? You're not going to be nice. You'll be mean. You have to prove himself, okay? Right, no free rides. You'll haze him. You'll give him a good hazing, okay? All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Jacob?